Good evening. Turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to get a regular joke. You know, they're better when Steve's not here. Hello, Steve. How you doing, brother? Did you? Well, this one's not. This one. Hey. This one's an old one. You probably heard it before. It's about a man that went to the doctor, and he was in really bad shape. And the doctor came in. He said, "You're in terrible shape." He said, "You need to do a few things." And he said, "Well, what do I need to do?" And he said, "Well," he said, "first of all," he said, you need to quit working so many hours. You need to work only 40 hours a week." And he said, "You need for your wife to cook you some good meals every night. And you need also to tell your wife to take the children out and let you relax and not have to do everything around the house." And he said, "Well," he said, you know, I don't know." And the doctor said, "Well," said, "if you don't," said, "you're not going to live a month." And the guy said, "Well," he said, "if you call my wife and tell her that, it'd sound better than me." And so the doctor said, "Okay." And so the man got in his car and he went home, and the wife ran out of the house and she said, "Oh no, I hear you only have 30 days left to live." So anyway, Hebrews chapter 12, as a Nate, I realize that, Steve, you know. I didn't tell you the one about the two guys that they worked at a local small factory, and they would always go to the cafeteria, but there was a little fast food restaurant across the street, and so one day they just decided to change scenery and go over there and eat. And so they carried their lunches that they, like every day, their sack lunches, they carried them, went in, and they sat down to eat. And the manager came in and said, "Fellas, what are you doing?" And they said, "Well, we're eating." And he said, "You can't eat your own sandwiches here in this restaurant." So they looked at one another, shrugged shoulders, and swapped sandwiches. So, you know, I didn't tell you that one. So anyway. I know. Hebrews 12. Oh, if you can't laugh at somebody, that's all right. You can laugh at me. I don't mind. Hebrews 12, that's what we're here for. Great chapter. We just finished the 11th chapter, the great faith chapter. Some call it the Hall of Faith chapter, where we talked about great individuals, male and female, that as the Hebrew writer kind of closed out the chapter as we have it, he said, "The world's not worthy of these great folks." The 12th chapter, as he's winding out this great book, is a chapter that simply reminds the reader today to persevere in your faith. Keep going. Don't stop. There is a part of this chapter, you get to really into about verse 18 through the end of the chapter, and it gets a little difficult to understand. And so when we get there, and if we get there tonight, we'll look at it and try to break it down and see. And we may disagree on what it says, and that's fine too. But let's see how far we get anyway. Let's begin in verse 1. "Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded with so great a cloud of witness, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from the sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your soul." Great verses, often quoted, often used. He begins, the book of Hebrews, the writer begins by saying, "Therefore." And we've talked about that being the bridge word. And so that bridges us from the 11th chapter, these folks of faith. Now he says, okay, therefore, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness. The word cloud there, or cloud of witnesses as it's translated, has one of two ideas. It can be the idea of one who bears witness. And so he could be saying, this cloud, these individuals, or there are individuals bearing witness. But it can also, the word itself can also have the idea of spectator. The image, at least that I pull up in my mind from this, is that there are those that were the great folks of faith, Hebrews chapter 11, and you can view it, and I'm going to try to give you both ways, but you can view it from the standpoint of these folks live such a life that their life bears witness to the fact of faith, and their witness by their life encourages us and shows us how to go forward. It can also be looked at from, I think, because there are really two definitions to this term, it can also be looked at from the standpoint of you have these great folks in the spiritual realm above that are looking down, if you will, and saying, you know, keep going, keep going. But then I realize that in saying that, if you think of that, you have a problem with Ecclesiastes 5 verse 15, where Solomon says that the dead know nothing under the sun, and how all that fits in, and that's a whole different lesson. But exactly what the Hebrew writer is saying, I can't say other than to say that he's saying these folks of faith, in Hebrews chapter 11, these folks, they surround, they are there, they're witnessing, if you will. And so look to them as individuals that were great examples of what you should be and how you should live your life. Because then he says, let us lay aside. So we looked at those individuals. Now he says, let us. Let us do what? Well, let's lay aside every weight. In biblical times, an athlete oftentimes would wear a vest. Matter of fact, I saw an individual this past Saturday walking down Charlotte. You could tell that he was a man that probably was worked out a lot. He was very muscular, and he had a vest on that you could tell had weights in it. And he was walking slowly. I don't know if he was at the end of his walk or the beginning of his walk or where it was in his walk, but in biblical times, New Testament times, an athlete was often seen wearing a vest with weights in it. And that was so, of course, that you'd be weighted down, you'd build your muscles up, and then when you take it vest off, you'd feel lighter and you'd feel like you could run. Now, the Hebrew writer says that weight of sin, we're going to lay it aside. And notice not only just the weight of sin, but he says, and the sin which so easily ensnares us. The word sin there is the idea of sin in general. The sin which so easily ensnares or traps us, which is the same thing if you stop and think about what James says in James chapter 1. Every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust. He is drawn away. The word that is used in James 1, draw away, really is the idea of what we think of a fishing lure. Lures us away, entices us, pulls us away. And so he says that we are pulled away and we are ensnared or we are trapped. And so the Hebrew writer says, let us run with endurance, or let us run with patience, the old King James Version says. The race that is set before us. Let us run with patience. The statement itself implies a struggle. Let's run with patience, endurance. Let's keep on going. But let's know we've got to endure. Think for just a second of the difference between running, say, a 50-yard dash and running a mile. For some of you, that may not be a great difference. It would be for me. But a 50-yard dash, what are you going to do? You're going to start out as fast as you can go, and you're going to probably make the end of that 50 yards going as fast as you can go. But if you run a mile, you're not going to do that. You may start out fast and end up slow, or you may start out slow and end up fast, depending upon how you're training, right? You may change your rate, your gait, somewhere in that mile. The difference being, though, the reason being because of the distance. Now, think about running a marathon, 24 miles. Think about running 24 miles a day, say. The difficulty, the speed at which you would run that, the struggle, a whole lot harder than to run a 50-yard dash and then sit down and say, I'm done for the day. And so the Hebrew writer says, let's run with endurance. Let's run with patience the race that is set before us. The word set before us has the idea of prescribed. In other words, there's a prescribed course. There's a set course. Well, here comes the question. How are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? And look at what he says. He says, first of all, we're going to look to Jesus. Keep our eyes on Jesus. Put our eyes on Jesus. The author, the word author simply means originator, one who takes a lead. And then the finisher, the one who completes it. He's the full expression of our salvation, of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Somebody explained to me the joy of the cross. That's real hard to understand, isn't it? When we think about the physical difficulties or physical pain, the torture of the cross. I'm sure, you've all heard through the years. And of course, I've read doctors' notes on the pain that would be, the nails that would go in approximately the lower wrist area, the nails in the feet. And these were not, more than likely, these weren't metal spikes. These were wooden spikes. You imagine the pain and the difficulty of breath on the cross, and how you'd have to push up with your feet and pull up with your arms in order just to take a breath. When you imagine that pain, I don't either.
And to be honest, until I saw the Passion of the Christ, I don't know that I thought it was like that.
Yeah.
And I know that there were some historians that said that was probably pretty true to what it actually was.
Right.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's just, and yet the Hebrew writer talks about joy.
Talking about the joy, talking about the endurance of the cross, because he knew the joy that was on the other side.
That's what I think. There's a great correlation. Not a great correlation. There is correlation. Correlation, if you look at the word joy in the Bible, with the idea of salvation. We often think of the joy that is within the Christian from the standpoint of there should be a feeling of exuberance. Well, that is a result of being a Christian, or should be, but there are a lot of Christians that aren't happy. The joy is the salvation itself. And so I think you're right. That's what I think. I agree with you.
You have to take joy and just add a little line and you got Jets.
Oh, man. That's a 5, Steve, right there, But yeah, the joy of set before him. He endured the cross. He knew what the end was. The end was death. He knew that. But he knew that end, being death, was for all mankind. And so he endured the cross, despising the shame. He didn't like the shame. Yeah, one of the things that we don't think about is that Jesus either had a very small loincloth on, or he had nothing on. Most folks that were crucified in New Testament times had nothing on them. And you can imagine that shame, the shame of being crucified between two thieves, the shame of being a public spectacle. But he sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. His end was great. He got to sit in the very best place. He got to go back to where he started from, right? I don't think you can, but Jesus did. Yeah. Remember Hebrews chapter 2, verse 5? Looking in, let this mind be in you which is also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of servant. Where was he? He was with God. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus got to go home.
Do you think being on earth changed him also?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer, but it's a great question. Yeah. It would be, in my opinion, it would be very hard not to have changed him some. Because he had the full understanding of what man goes through. Now, that gets you into a great thought. If you stop and think about, I don't think that I as a preacher have to experience every sin in the world to preach, and I can condemn certain sins even though I haven't practiced them. But it is to say that if I have gone through that I surely do understand it better. I think I've shared with one or two of you. I had an elder in Waverly. He is no longer an elder. A wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man that while I was there had a stroke. And his stroke was pretty severe and couldn't get him the medicine in time that he needed to help calm that. And speech was affected some. But he was able to get out a little later. But there was about 6, 8, 10 weeks, I forgot now which, that he couldn't drive a car. And so he was at the mercy of his wife. His wife was a school teacher, wonderful, wonderful lady. She was a school teacher. And, of course, she had to go to work. His mother and father, they did not drive. Matter of fact, were dependent upon him to drive them around from time to time. And I remember Walter, I'll just call his name was Walter. Walter came into my office the first day he could drive. The first place he stopped, church building, because he was an elder in church, like I said. And he walked into my office and he said, I didn't understand about not being able to drive and go where you want to, when you want to. But now I understand. Now I understand. And they gave me a lot of good insights into things. But Jesus living upon the earth truly better understands, if he didn't already. Of course, you could say, well, he's God. Yeah, we can argue that other side too. But he truly saw man in his extremities, and he went through them. For he was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So, could it? It could have. It may not have, but it could have. Very much so. Anything else? For consider him who endured, verse 3. The word consider, reason up, think through. Consider Jesus who endured. There's that word, endured. He endured it. Such hostility from sinners against himself. Somebody made the statement that I was studying, said that Jesus suffered, and he did, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. How true. That Jesus suffered the hostility from sinners against himself. The Hebrew writer says, consider him, lest you become weary. And he says, Now, the reason he said all this, the reason he has said what he said in verses 1 and 2 and 3, or the first part of verse 3, is he says, I don't want you to become weary. I don't want you to, the word weary there is the idea of spent or ready to collapse. I don't want you to become weary, and I don't want you to become discouraged. And this word that's translated discouraged here is the idea of being exhausted, working, laboring to the point of exhaustion, and being exhausted to the point that, you just fall out. There's no more strength left. He says, I don't want that to happen to you. And so the Hebrew writer in verses 1, 2, and 3 basically says, I want you to persevere in your faith. And how you're going to do that, I think, is really twofold. You're going to remember those that we talked about in Hebrews chapter 11, that the world was not worthy of, and their great faith. And you're going to look to Jesus, and you're going to remember him and what he did and what he went through for you. Anything else? Well, verse 4 is an interesting verse. He says, you've not yet resisted bloodshed, striving against sin. There are some that look at this verse and say, well, this verse right here dates the book of Hebrews. It depends on how you take it. If you take it the way they say that this is talking about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And so that dates this book before that time frame. That's pulling that one verse out of context and trying to make it mean something. Now, could that be possible? True. But think within the context of what he's talking about. He says, you persevere in your faith, but no, verse 4, you haven't been pushed to the point of suffering death like Jesus. See, if you put it within its context, he's basically saying the ultimate test for you would be to suffer bloodshed. And he says, you haven't done that striving against sin. It's almost as if he's saying, you've got it bad, but you don't have it as bad as Jesus had it. So don't stop. Keep going. Keep marching. Keep pushing forward. And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. Beginning in verse 5 and going through verse 11 are oftentimes verses that we use in talking about pain and suffering and hurting, and they fit very well. But let's kind of break it down within the context of what is being said here. First of all, let's look at verse 5. And what we have here is a quote out of Proverbs chapter 3. He says, you've forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. That carries you back a little bit. I want you to kind of jump off this train of Hebrews for just a minute and jump on the train of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1, my son, hear the instruction of your father, forsake not the law of your mother. And then he begins. You see, the preacher begins, if you will, that's what he calls himself. The preacher begins by admonishing the son in Proverbs chapter 1 to listen. That sets up that book of Proverbs. All those sayings. Think about all those sayings. All those sayings may have been original from Solomon and may not have been. Have you ever thought about, and like I say, I'm jumping on a little train here, a little side train just for a second. You ever thought about the book of Proverbs from the standpoint of a collection of sayings by Solomon, based upon the fact that not only was he the wisest man in all the earth, but how did people respond to him? They came from everywhere to see him, to listen to him, to hear him. And don't you know, not only brought, as the text tells us back in the Old Testament, they didn't only just bring, gold and silver and gifts. What else would they have brought? Questions, answers. Some of them would have thought they'd had answers. Wisdom, thoughts. And we have, probably not all of them, but many of them today in the book of Proverbs, and they are wonderful. And the book of Proverbs is one of those books of the Bible that you can't read a chapter or 2 chapters or 3 chapters or 10 chapters and sit down and say, yep, got it all. You need to read almost like 1 to 2 to 3 verses, and that's about it. That's about all you can swallow in a day. Well, in Proverbs chapter 3, the Hebrew writer says, you've forgotten that exhortation to the son. But remember it. For it says what? Do not despise the chastening. What does the chastening mean? What does the word chasten mean? Correction? Correcting, yeah. Correction. It has the idea of the training of a child. Yeah, it's the idea of training. And it would include all of that. The chastening of the Lord. Don't regard lightly. The thought is, don't miss the lesson. Let's jump off on this train for just a second because it ties in with all of this now in Hebrews chapter 12. How many of you like pain? How many of you like suffering? None of you. None of us like it. I mean, I've never gone through a painful experience in my life where I really said I enjoyed it or I appreciated the ride. But I do realize that in going through it, it really is a good lesson for me. And there are lessons to be learned if I will open my eyes and watch and listen. And I think to a large degree that's what the Hebrew writer's saying here. Don't miss seeing the picture. Don't miss the lesson. Nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. When problems come, how do we react? There's several different ways you can react. But when problems come, how can you react? You can run away from them, right? You can pray. Stay there and fight. Yeah, with help. You can ignore them. Stick your head in the sand like the old ostrich. You're going to need help. Problems come. And it's not that problems, how we handle them, how we react to them. And the Hebrew writer says, don't be discouraged when you're rebuked by them. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens. There's that word again, disciplines. And scourges every son whom he receives. Did you catch that? There's not a child of God that's not going to have problems. Now, don't you feel better now? Not really. Not really. But you should. The problems in life make sure that you're alive, right? Smooth sailing would be nice. Let's don't sugarcoat this and let's don't deny it. It would be nice to have smooth sailing. But then at the same time too, how would our faith grow? Doesn't faith grow the most when it's challenged? Not to say that it doesn't grow at all the time. Don't we make better strides when we're challenged? Good point. Good point.
Most people don't want to leave here, though.
Kind of like that old song that said, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to go right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you do, a lot of people do get to the point in their life where they are ready to go.
Yeah.
We had a member here for a long time, and you go to see him, he would pray hard and say, I don't know why I'm still here. I don't know why the Lord's not taking me.
Oh, my mother, yeah, the last several years of her life. And of course, I was my mother's little boy. But I was also, after Dad died, I was also, so to speak, Mom's preacher, counselor. And sometimes when I went to visit, I had to take off my son's hat and put on my preacher hat because that's what she wanted me to do, because she needed somebody to talk to. And so, yeah, you get to that point. You can. All very true. All very true. That it's not fun. Not thinking about going to heaven, I thought about the story of the guy that went to sleep every sermon. And so the preacher decided that he would get the man. And so he said, all of a sudden in the middle of his sermon, that brother was asleep again. And so the preacher just shouted, everybody that wants to go to heaven, stand up. And all the congregation stood up, but just one man. And all of a sudden he kind of roused up, and the preacher said, well, brother, don't you want to go to heaven? He said, yeah, but I thought you was getting up a load right now. So anyway, we have problems. And the 7th verse, he says, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? Now, true or false? Spare a rod, spoil a child's in the Bible. He that does not discipline his child hates his child. But the words spare the rod, spoil the child were in Poor Richard's Almanac, Ben Franklin. But Proverbs 23 teaches us discipline of children. And my mom and daddy believed in discipline. You've heard me say that I became a preacher because I went out twice every church service, and it wasn't to get a drink of water. And so I told my mama, I said, I became a preacher to get away from you. And so, but he says here, he says, listen up, sons. You're going to be chastened. You're going to have difficult times. But, verse 8, if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Now, think about this. You don't have problems? You're not God's child. Wow. That's what he's saying. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? Now, let me put this in verse 9 the way I see it from the standpoint of there's a lot of people that began to question God when they have problems. There's a lot of Christians that quit being Christians when they have problems. I don't know if you all are familiar with a fellow that's about this tall by the name of Steve Higginbotham. He preaches at the Carnes Church of Christ in Knoxville, Tennessee. But Steve is, 6'6", 6'7" probably. Steve was at Freed Hardeman when Suzanne and I was at Freed Hardeman. He graduated when I graduated. He started when I started and got out when I got out. Steve is a really good guy, really good preacher. I was just happening Monday to listening to a sermon that he had preached this past Sunday. Steve was diagnosed almost a year ago with cancer, melanoma cancer, that he had spots in his lung, He had spots in his brain. He had spots through his body. He had stage 4 cancer. And everything's gone except now he said a couple of spots were still in his body, but everything else was gone. But he was talking about, why I say all that is his sermon Sunday that I was listening to was about suffering. And he said that the number one argument that atheists have against God is suffering. I'm not sure I agree with Steve on that point, but it was a good thought. Because what happens is, in the midst of suffering, we turn on God because we have this idea that everything ought to be great. And there are religious teachers in our day and age, not that don't have the same faith I have, they have a different faith, that are teaching a health and wealth God. But the Bible doesn't teach that, does it? Matter of fact, it teaches the opposite of that. And so the Hebrew writer says, we treated our fathers with respect, so why shouldn't we treat God? For they indeed for a few days chasten us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. In other words, we go through the problems of life so that we can be better Christians, so that we can partake in the holiness that is set before us. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterwards it does yield the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. We're open to teaching. You can become hardened to your problems, or you can become open to teaching. And the Hebrew writer says you need to be open to teaching. Now go back to verse 4. If verse 4, and I don't necessarily think that it does, but if verse 4 is a verse that times this book, puts it in chronological time, this was a time of suffering. And the Hebrew writer says, don't let it stop your faith. Don't let it hinder what you believe. Don't let it hinder you believing in God. That's a great lesson for us, isn't it? Faith's not fun, but pain's not fun, but faith gets us through it. And faith will keep us through it. But we've got to hold on to God in the midst of it. Is there anything else? And I know I didn't let you talk a lot. Sorry. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about or mention in that text?
Well, Paul, and I know we've all seen this when something bad happens in our life, or in anybody's life, that we know and we see it and we say, why did God let that happen? But when we have all the joy and of the ordinary days, how does it we stop and say, thank you, God? We're quick to blame, but not as fast to give blame.
Absolutely. Great point.
As far as suffering, I've had my problems with life. But the thing that I've tried to glean from these things that have come along in life is that I'm more prepared to aid somebody along the path that they may have to go down. And until you've been there, you don't really know. You can know in a way, but
You better understand.
you do, and you need to be prepared to help somebody else with their problems.
I agree. Yeah. The thing every Christian should really hone in on is just what you said. Paul said, talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, that he was better able to serve others because of what he'd gone through. And every Christian should remember this is not a selfish race for me to win by myself. That I'm running in a Christian race and I should help as many people as possible. And when I go through problems, I should learn and be able then to help somebody through their problems. Very good. Very true statement. Anything else? Yeah, Christians. Yes, dear.
You know, I don't know how the providence of God works, but I know my mother died when I was 2 years old. And, you know, thankfully I had grandparents that raised me and people that loved me, and I had good influences in my life and all. And as I was teaching school, in 29 years of teaching, I had 4 students who lost a parent while they were in my class. And, you know, I don't know how God's providence works, but I hope I was able to be a good teacher for them during that time and be with them and be a little bit encouraging and kind and understanding.
Yeah, and then she came home to get out on me. No, that's not true. That's not true. Anything else? She's a pretty special lady. I'll keep her around. Got a lot invested in her.
Wouldn't be what I'd be worried about.
She didn't know what the guns are. Thank you. Y'all have a great week.